Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Brennan, and I want to thank the International Association for the Study of Popular Music for inviting me to present a few of the ideas from my new book, Kick It, A Social History of the Drum Kit, which was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. Over the next 30 minutes, I want to make the case for the drum kit as one of the most transformative musical inventions of the modern era. So let's get started.
I'm in love with him and I intend to marry him.
A drummer? Or even a real musician, he just makes a noise.
You don't know what you're talking about.
If he played the violin or the piano, anything that made sense, but the drums.
The first thing to say is that I can hardly believe, and also feel very lucky, that there hasn't been a book-length scholarly history of the drum kit until now. And I think part of the reason for this is that the drum kit has often been represented as a low-status instrument. Take, for example, the drummer Max Weinberg, who you can see pictured here with an unknown guitarist that I hope, one day with enough research, we'll be able to identify. In a 1982 interview for Modern Drummer, Max suggested that, quote, most musicians are frustrated, but especially drummers. Drummers, by and large, have to depend on other musicians. Learning any instrument is very solitary, but being a drummer is like the old joke. How many guys in your band? We got 10 musicians and a drummer. Fighting against that thing is kind of hard. I talk to drummers about this, and guys who know themselves will admit to it. End quote. By 1982, then, drummer jokes were already old. And the question for me became, how old? Where do they come from? What ideological work do they do? And how do they relate to the history of the drum kit as an instrument? Some people might associate this kind of poking fun with the character of Animal, who first appears in the pilot episode of The Muppet Show in 1975. Legend has it that Animal's character was inspired by Keith Moon, but there's no evidence in the original sketches for the character, seen here, that suggest he was based on any one drummer in particular. Instead, it's a vague caricature of the primitive tribal savage, which was a not uncommon way of representing figures from rock and roll culture more broadly. But can we find evidence of drummer jokes earlier than this primitive caricature of Animal? Yes, we can. In fact, the title of the best-selling drum magazine in North America, Modern Drummer, is derived from a mostly forgotten early 20th century distinction between modern or progressive drummers on the one hand, who played the newly invented instrument known then as the trap drummer's outfit, versus primitive drummers on the other, with all the racist ideological baggage that you might imagine coming along with that distinction. Around the same time as the discourse of modern versus primitive drummers was in play, we can also find cartoons poking fun at the types of unusual instruments a drummer commonly played in theater and dance orchestras. Drummers were routinely in charge of playing the sound effects to accompany comedy and vaudeville routines, as well as silent film, and this both set the drummer apart from fellow musicians, but also made them of central importance. But can we find evidence of drummer jokes earlier than the 20th century? Yes, we can. In 1884, the New York Times ran a profile piece entitled The Orchestra at Work, which describes a typical day in the life of a New York City drummer, who is the first to arrive at rehearsal, since he is also the orchestra's librarian, responsible for distributing the music scores before setting up the numerous percussion instruments required for a typical theater performance. He then dives down into the band room to bring up the other percussion instruments required for the comic opera to be performed that evening. Other members of the orchestra trickle into the theater in the run-up to showtime, and it's only moments before the curtain rises that the high-prestige players, the first violins, finally appear. Quote, self-important, accomplished musicians, jovial companions, and marvelous consumers of beer, they bounce in at almost the last minute and begin to crack jokes at the expense of the drummer. End quote. But can we find evidence of drummer jokes earlier than 1884? Yes, we can. Way back in 1511, in the first ever printed treatise on music instrumentation, the Musica Getuscht, written by the priest and composer Sebastian Verdung in Heidelberg, Verdung chooses to exclude drums from detailed analysis in his Encyclopedia of Instruments, explaining that, quote, I verily believe that the devil must have had the devising and making of them, for there is no pleasure or anything good about them. If hammering and raising a din be music, then coopers and those who make barrels must be musicians." End quote. This is basically a variation on the joke, "What do you call someone who hangs around with musicians?" Except now we know that people have been telling this joke about drummers for over 5 centuries. Drummer jokes and other examples of not taking the drum kit seriously are abundant in documents of Western musical culture, and their punchlines hinge on stereotypes about drummers as musicians and drums as instruments. Therefore, the question I pose in the book is, if drummers historically had a hard time getting recognition as being proper musicians, and the drum kit as being a proper instrument, what can the history of their status reveal about the taken-for-granted assumptions about what being a real musician and playing a real instrument entails? It allows us to interrogate the social construction of musical value from the bottom up. The stereotypes associated with drummers over history found a focal point with the invention of the drum kit as a new instrument. But this was because the drum kit undermined a cultural hierarchy. The musical upheaval represented by the trap drummer's outfit, which fundamentally incorporated influences outside the European classical tradition, was nothing short of a direct challenge to European cultural imperialism. And for this reason, music where the sounds of the kick, snare, and cymbals had a strong presence tended to be categorized at the time not as music, but as noise. There's a flip side to this low status, because the drum kit is also frequently represented as the rhythmic backbone of popular music over the last century. From the acoustic kit in jazz up to the sampled and synthesized sounds of drum programming in electronic dance music. I'm interested in this dual status of the drum kit and drummers, their simultaneous marginalization on the one hand, and centrality on the other. In other words, the drum kit is a powerful lens through which we can freshly examine how the meanings of key concepts like musician, technique, creativity, authorship, talent, and musical value have changed over history and across cultures. And the central argument of my book is that the history of the drum kit, drummers, and drumming not only illustrate these changes, but actively shape them. The ways we choose to tell the history of music have consequences, and I'm going to use the invention of the drum kit as an example to illustrate how this works in practice. When you try to pinpoint the moment when the drum kit begins to take shape as a new instrument, one common answer is that it's the moment when someone takes a bass drum or cymbals, historically played in a military or marching band by a person standing up, and has the big idea to place them on the ground, freeing up the hands to play other percussion instruments at the same time. So when did the foot pedal for drums and cymbals first arrive on the scene? This is actually not a straightforward question to answer. In order to illustrate the complexity of the problem, I'm going to present 5 potential candidates for the bass drum pedal's moment of origin, each with its own narrative advantages and disadvantages. Option 1 is that bass drum pedals have existed from at least the early 19th century, but robust documentation proving their existence hasn't survived. These are illustrations from early 19th century France that portray at least 2 different one-man bands using homemade beaters attached to their feet to play a drum with one foot and a pair of cymbals with the other. Based on this evidence, you could argue that foot pedals for drums and cymbals were likely discovered by multiple people independently in different countries from at least the beginning of the 19th century and possibly earlier. Here we begin to see that choosing a particular origin narrative for an instrument serves a particular agenda. This first version of the bass drum pedal origin story privileges the international roots of the technologies that inform the drum kit as an instrument, and also a multiple discovery theory, where no single person is attributed as the inventor. This origin narrative also deprivileges innovations that have documented widespread impact. The devices in these illustrations were clearly one-offs and never mass-produced. And it also deprivileges the United States as the country of origin for the proto-drum kit. Option 2 is the oldest surviving example of a foot-operated drum pedal located somewhat surprisingly in the Keswick Museum in England. This pedal was created by an inventor named Cornelius Ward for the novelty Richardson Family Rock Band. They were a real thing. They played stone lithophones for Queen Victoria. If we chose this as a moment of origin, it privileges a single inventor, the role of drummers in novelty music as opposed to jazz, for example, and also historical instruments in museum collections as a source of evidence. Option 3 is the oldest legal patent for a bass drum pedal, which dates back to 1887, filed by George Olney in the great state of Missouri. This option privileges legal patents as documents of record, but deprivileges those who may have come up with a similar design but didn't manage or were somehow prevented from patenting their idea. I say this because it brings us to option 4, which is the earliest photograph of a drummer next to his bass drum pedal, D.D. Chandler in New Orleans circa 1896, and it looks remarkably similar to the Olney patent. This option privileges African American culture, photographic evidence, and the notion that the drum kit only coalesces as an instrument through a particular kind of musical performance practice, such as dance music influenced by New Orleans second-line drumming. It deprivileges patents as evidence, countries outside the United States, and popular music not rooted in an African American musical tradition. Option 5 is arguably the most famous of all the candidates so far, and that's William F. Ludwig's 1909 patent for a highly commercially successful and influential bass drum pedal design. This option privileges the overall impact a design has on the rest of drumming culture. From 1909 onward, Ludwig's design is not only successfully mass-produced and sold, but also widely imitated by other manufacturers. So what do we learn from looking at these examples? For me, the point of outlining 5 different possible origin moments for the bass drum pedal is not to then select one of them as the definitive version. In fact, I refuse to do that. Instead, the point is to draw attention to the historiography of the drum kit as an instrument. By emphasizing different moments in its development, you can frame the drum kit as a uniquely American technology or a global technology that combines different national traditions. It can be a technology invented by a small handful of individuals, or an instrument that gradually evolved over decades, involving lots of different named and nameless makers and multiple discoveries. Its design can be framed as an organic response to an interaction of particular musical styles, like the mixing of West African diasporic performance practices and European military music, or as a product arising from a particular industrial context, the result of specific economic and labor issues. But more importantly, by refusing to choose a single origin story as definitive, and instead giving attention to these multiple origin moments and their implications, we can gain a better understanding of who and what we are including and excluding in the stories we tell about music and why. The historiographical lesson learned from the bass drum pedal can be applied to the invention of the drum kit in full as a distinct instrument. There is more than one possible moment of origin. Does the first drum kit appear in 1906, when the Philadelphia-based instrument manufacturer J.W. Pepper publishes a catalog featuring a pre-bundled trap drummer's outfit comprising a bass drum, snare drum, cymbal, and bass drum pedal? Or is it 1918, when Ludwig and Ludwig first advertised their own Jazzer Up outfit, equipped with their influential bass drum pedal? Or is it in 1928, when a new accessory that we retrospectively recognize as a hi-hat pedal begins to appear in multiple drum manufacturer catalogs? Or do we have to wait until 1936, when Gene Krupa collaborates with the Slingerland Company to design the groundbreaking Radio King series of drum kits equipped with separate tension tom-tom drums? To complicate matters further, what happens when electronic drum kits are introduced from the 1980s onwards, or virtual drum kits from the 2000s onwards? Can a drum kit be acoustic, electronic, or virtual, and still count as a drum kit? If this question causes even a modest amount of debate, then we have to assume that the meaning of a drum kit is not fully stable. The pioneers of the acoustic drum kit could not have predicted that in the 21st century, Debates regarding the meanings of the terms drum kit, drummer, and drumming would include voices from computer software engineers and multinational corporations packaging virtual drummers into their digital audio workstations. Nevertheless, all of these actors influence our contemporary understanding of what counts as a drum kit, drummer, or drumming performance. To ask such questions is to point toward a broader question in the sociology of knowledge. What aspects of its design must stay the same in order for a drum kit to remain a drum kit over time? In the 21st century, when as many or more electronic drum kits are sold relative to acoustic drum kits, and when the sounds of multiple drum kits can be stored and deployed within a single software plugin, is the definition of what constitutes a drum kit categorically fixed? My argument is that it's not and never was. And this is what I mean when I say that the drum kit is not a fixed object, but a theoretical concept, whose meaning is shaped and adapted by consensus over time. With this expanded definition of the drum kit from a musical object to a musical concept that changes and adapts to new technological contexts, we can begin to see how the drum kit's distinct sonic palette has shaped myriad popular music genres all the way from the late 19th to the early 21st centuries. We're probably already familiar with the importance of kick, snare, and cymbal sounds in the development of electronic dance music, and in hip-hop, where pioneers like Kool Herc used identical copies of vinyl records on a pair of turntables to play back only the funky drum break sections that crowds loved to dance to at legendary block parties in the 1970s. So instead, I'll pick some moments from earlier in the 20th century when the drum kit shaped new genres. At the beginning of the 20th century, just as now, what was often at stake was whether new forms of music even got recognized as music, or risked being dismissed as noise, a sonic nuisance without value. In the thick of this battle was the drum kit. Here we can see the influential ragtime drumming star Buddy Gilmore, with his kit including car motor horns, cowbell, and Chinese tam-tam and cymbal in the mix. Drummers like Gilmore were influential in the classical world too, with composers drawing inspiration from unconventional percussion and syncopation that was embedded into the performance practice of the early drum kit. In 1914, when dancing stars Vernon and Irene Castle made their famous tour across the United States with the James Europe Ragtime Orchestra, popularizing African-American dances like the foxtrot and the bunny hug, the Castles would dance on stage with the orchestra playing in the pit, apart from Gilmore, who shared the spotlight on stage with the Castles, with the show culminating in a drum battle between Gilmore and Vernon Castle. When ragtime evolved into jazz, and jazz spread out from the USA to other countries, journalists were quick to identify the trap drummer and their instrument as the key distinguishing feature of a jazz band. An Australian newspaper article from 1918, describing the country's first experience of jazz concerts, identified the drummer as the one who, quote, runs the band, end quote. Similarly, in 1919, the London Times reported on the new phenomenon of touring jazz bands with the headline, quote, Art of the Jazz, Drummer as Chief Conspirator, end quote. Well, in the same year, a newspaper article from Brazil again concluded that an American touring jazz band had the drummer as, quote, the most important player in the jazz band, end quote. By 1922, a New York Times feature on the global migration of jazz observed that, quote, every jazz band in Asia, Africa, or Europe starts with the drum and trap accessories as a nucleus. This constitutes the jazz. The rest merely band, end quote. Fast forward to the Second World War and the invention of bebop, where historian Scott DeVoe convincingly argues that, quote, the first piece of the bebop puzzle to fall into place, end quote, was the innovative playing of drummer Kenny Clarke, who provided an innovative, liberating rhythmic foundation for improvising soloists, initiating a shimmering spang-a-lang swing rhythm on the top cymbal, complemented by syncopated accents on bass and snare. Realizing the musical possibilities afforded by the new form of drumming, Dizzy Gillespie took it upon himself to become a drum teacher and instructed other drummers across New York City how to play like Kenny Clarke, a style that would eventually be universally adopted by jazz drummers. Another key bebop drummer, Max Roach, expanded this approach into the realms of the drum solo. Recalling his groundbreaking solo composition, Drum Conversation, Roach said, quote, "People would ask me, where are the chords? Where's the melody? And I would say, it's about design. It isn't about melody and harmony. Think of it as constructing a building with sound. It's architecture." End quote. Following Max Roach, my argument is that the music of the drum kit is nothing less than the architecture on which many of the most significant popular music genres are built. Drummers historically have rarely received credit, especially formal and financially remunerative credits as co-writers for individual songs. But the point here is that the role of the drum kit is actually more important than any individual song can contain. When a substantial change occurs within the sonic palette of the drum kit, it can inspire not just a song, but an entirely new genre of music, and it's done this repeatedly over time. As bebop opened the gateway for new polyrhythmic potential in the jazz tradition, jazz and blues-based music that maintained a steady dance beat followed a path that led to jump blues, rhythm and blues, and ultimately rock and roll, also known in the 1950s as big beat music. In New York City, Alan Freed's Rock and Roll Dance Party in January 1955 featured Big Joe Turner, Fats Domino, The Drifters, and others, and as the headline from Variety declared, R&B big beat in pop music, it went on to describe the defining element of the evening. Quote, "All the performers introduced by Freed were characterized by an insistent, unmistakable beat. Whether instrumental or vocal, the combos based their arrangements on a bedrock repetitive rhythm that seemed to hypnotize kids into one swaying, screaming mass." End quote. In the Deep South, only a few weeks earlier, rockabilly singer Elvis Presley appeared on the Louisiana Hayride radio show. Presley didn't normally play with a drummer at this point in his career, but the Louisiana Hayride had a house drummer, DJ Fontana. The Elvis that we now recognize from those first famous TV appearances, with the gyrations and hip-swiveling performance that drove audiences wild, didn't exist yet, but that was about to change. Because when Fontana wasn't drumming on the radio, the rest of the week he was a drummer in strip clubs, accompanying exotic dancers. Presley and Fontana hit it off immediately upon meeting one another, on both a musical and personal level, and Elvis's stage act began to change. As Fontana put it, quote, "I'd throw a cymbal crash here, a tom-tom fill there, give him a little beat with the kick drum. He loved it. It was fun. Elvis weren't no dummy," said Fontana. "If he saw something that worked, he kept it." End quote. What worked in this case was the drum kit. All of this brings us back to the question of what kind of work the drummer is actually doing in a band, and how they should be paid for their work. Perhaps more than any other instrument, the invention of the drum kit was linked to issues of musical labor, and in particular, reducing the cost of that labor. What was the impetus for the creation of the drum kit? The answer comes in the form of a question. Why hire 3 separate percussionists to play bass drum, snare drum, and cymbals individually, when you could pay just one drummer to play all those instruments at once? This idea is beautifully illustrated in a cartoon from the Musicians' Union Report and Journal in 1913. The octopus represents the physically demanding nature of the drummer's job, while the price tags illustrated on each of the instruments note the considerable financial investment a drummer needed to make in order to be able to play at all. The consequence of having one player responsible for such a large number of instruments was a different form of offstage labor which continues to plague drummers up to the present day. That of having more gear to haul than everyone else, as this cartoon from the Musicians' Union Journal in 1920 nicely illustrates. The theme of drummers being poorly paid for their work goes back a long way. One of the first significant mentions of drummers in the Musicians' Union reports is from 1907. That was the year when actors, musicians, and other theater workers in music halls organized with their representative unions and demanded better wages, conditions, and regularity of work in music halls. This resulted in a largely successful boycott and the temporary closure of 22 theaters in London. As a result, the president of the Board of Trade appointed the barrister George Asquith to negotiate an agreement. Asquith is pictured here with facial hair that wouldn't look out of place in a 21st century artisan cafe. What became known as the Asquith Award, which guaranteed musicians their jobs back and a minimum wage of 30 shillings a week. Except for drummers. Quote, "There shall henceforth be paid a wage of 30 shillings a week to all musicians, except drummers. Drummers, 28 shillings." End quote. This speaks volumes about the low status which was accorded to drummers as musicians and distinctions being made between skilled and unskilled labor, or the perception of such. In the accounts of the meeting where this decision was made, it was noted that theater managers raised concerns about rivalry in the orchestra if everyone was paid the same amount. In their words, quote, "The first violin would be jealous because the drummer was getting as much as he was. It was stated at the arbitration proceedings that anyone could learn the drums sufficiently in 6 months to play in a music hall." End quote. Drumming is also gendered work, of course. As the instrument was taking shape, so too were assumptions about what type of person played it. Indeed, perhaps the most widespread stereotype about drummers is that they're assumed to be male. Drumming was perceived to be exceptionally physical, itinerant, and publicly demonstrative musical work. On top of that, most professional drummers first learnt their skills in a military context. All of the above characteristics were perceived to be unladylike, if not outright prohibited behaviors for women, making it much more difficult for them to make inroads into the profession. Despite these obstacles, however, there's compelling evidence to suggest that women actively participated in drumming culture in the USA and elsewhere. Drummers didn't fare particularly well either under music copyright regimes, which were historically designed to privilege melody, harmony, and lyrics. Just ask Clyde Stubblefield, who was one of many drummers who contributed to the music of James Brown without ever receiving co-writing credits. Such examples raise an interesting question, namely, what exactly is the threshold between a substantive and original musical contribution on the drum kit and a stock part on the other? Would "Don't Fear the Reaper" by Blue Oyster Cult have been such a huge hit without that cowbell part played by the band's drummer, Albert Bouchard? A Washington Post article notes that, quote, "According to his bandmates, Albert thought the producer's insistence on more cowbell was crazy, but he put all this tape around a cowbell and played it. It really pulled the track together." End quote. To my knowledge, Bouchard has never litigated for a songwriting credit, and it seems insane for anyone to claim that he should. But where is the boundary lie between a case like that of Clyde Stubblefield and the Blue Oyster Cult scenario? A discussion for another day, perhaps. To sum up, the book's overarching argument is that the social history of the drum kit as a modern instrument can be told as a drum-centric history of music as a whole from the 19th century to the present. Drum-centric because the kit profoundly shaped this history, yet rarely gets credit for doing so. The history of the drum kit is necessarily a musical history of the United States, shaped by the cultural currents ebbing and flowing across its borders. Through the lens of the drum kit, this book charts the history not only of America's outward cultural impact, but also the international music cultures that influenced America. The book aims to situate the story of the drum kit within larger narratives, including the changing global dynamics of music business, education, creativity, race and gender relations, human migration, and the unstable divide between high and low culture. If you're interested in reading more about these ideas, I'll end with a little shameless plug. I had organized a book launch in Glasgow for the end of March 2020, but that turned out to be bad timing. This means that I currently have about 30 copies of the book sitting in my office that I was hoping to sell at the face-to-face launch, and if anyone attending this session would like to order one direct from me for a very fair price, and if you don't mind waiting for lockdown in Scotland to end so I can actually get back into my office and post you a copy, then feel free to email me at matt.brennan@glasgow.ac.uk. Or, if you prefer to order one that will be shipped immediately, you can go to oup.com/academic and order the book, or indeed several books written by our very own IASPM members, which are currently all 30% off when you use the discount code HOLIDAY20 at the checkout. Thanks very much for listening, thanks to IASPM for hosting, and I look forward to chatting to you in the Q&A.